Good morning. I have tried to bring out at every single period since I am in this work that the secret is individual unfoldment. In other words, no demonstration can rise higher than the source from which it emanates. And what is the source? So far as you are concerned, it's your consciousness. No demonstration can ever rise higher than your consciousness. Now, if you attain the consciousness of Christ as the source, substance, and activity of your experience must begin to approach infinity. If you think that your understanding or your wisdom or your strength is responsible, then in that degree must your demonstration be finite. You see that? Now, we have Jesus and 12 disciples. Who was the best healer? God, Jesus. Why should he have been the best healer? Now answer me on that. They all had the same teaching because he gave it to them. Now why should he have been the best healer? Did God respect him any more than the 12 disciples? No. He attained a higher degree of Christ awareness than they. Of the disciples, who do we look upon as the best or greatest or most in achievement? John, Peter. They stand out above the other 10. Why? They all had the same teaching. They all had the same teacher. They all had the same 3 years. Well, it was their individual demonstration. Now, 30 years later, along comes Paul. And Paul is undoubtedly greater than any of those who were actually physically present with the Master. You see that? Why? He didn't have the benefit of the teacher. He didn't have the benefit of 3 years personal contact. Yet his consciousness rose higher than those who did. So it is. We are all in the same boat. If it is possible for this activity to flourish wherever I have been with it, as you have seen it in several cities, and as you know about it in these foreign lands, then it is possible for, if not that same full degree, for a great measure of that degree, to come to any one student. Because any one student would, to begin with, be responsible only for their little local activity, community, or city. But if they developed a success in their community or city, they would certainly soon have a state. And if a state, then 3 states. Do you see what I'm getting at? Because nothing can limit the state of consciousness that realizes the activity of Christ. Now, if an individual had the benefit of the foundational work that they receive in Christian Science, they can develop spiritual consciousness. It is probably the only metaphysical teaching on the face of the earth outside of the infinite way of which that could be said. There are individuals in unity and in New Thought who can attain spiritual consciousness, but not from those teachings. They would have to attain it in spite of those teachings, because the mistakes and errors of those teachings are so far beyond any truth that's in them that you'd have to rise very, very high above the teachings, above the limitations of the teachings, in order to achieve spiritual consciousness. But there is enough in Christian Science for anyone to do what, let us say, Bicknell Young did, Dr. DeLonge, Richard Davis, Nunn, so many others that we could name, who have really shown forth healing and teaching consciousness. Do you see that? Now, we should do better than they, because the Christian Science teaching embraces both a mental and a spiritual science. And your spiritual development would come only as you are able to brush aside the mental science and abide wholly in the spiritual science. In this we have no mental science. Even the letter of truth isn't a mental science, because it isn't anything that you rely on for your work. It is merely the foundation through which you open consciousness. But if you had Lao Tzu, Buddha, and Jesus Christ all combined as your teacher, and your spiritual centers were not opened, it would be of no value. There were many who had the benefit of Jesus Christ's teaching who amounted to nothing. We know of hundreds who had Mrs. Eddy's teaching and amounted to nothing. But a dozen became internationally known figures, all through their healing and teaching consciousness. Do you see that? Now, it is so with us. There is an infinity of people in this world. Even measured in numbers, there are 4 billions. And you can have as many of them for patients and students as your consciousness can embrace. There isn't any reason why any individual in the world can't have 1 million followers if their consciousness can embrace it. That is, if they attain that degree of spiritual consciousness. This isn't anything that isn't proven, and we don't have to go back to ancient days to prove it, but we can prove it by the followers that Mrs. Eddy has built in the world, the followers that Mrs. Fillmore has built in the world. Do you see what I'm getting at? The followers that Divine Science of Denver has built in the world, the followers that Father Divine has built, the followers that Brother Manders has built. How do they build those? Through their own consciousness. If there were any other way, everybody else could do it. If you could say, oh, newspaper advertising. Well, isn't newspaper advertising available to everybody? But newspaper advertising will not do it on any permanent basis. No kind of advertising will do it. Yes, it'll bring you a temporary inflow and it peters out. There have been many, many metaphysicians who have built up classes of 1,000 students. And then 20 years later, were having help for supply for themselves and for health. But you don't find those who developed their work through their degree of spiritual consciousness in that fix. Oh, no. No, Mrs. Eddy wasn't in that fix, and Bicknell Young wasn't, and Mrs. Fillmore wasn't, and so forth and so forth and so on. They had sufficient degrees of developed, cultured, spiritual consciousness that appeared outwardly as their patients, their students, their dollars, their properties. So it is today. Already in its young years, there have been several students of the infinite way who thought, because they saw what looked like my success, that they could go and do likewise. And if I could do it with the infinite way, they could do it with the infinite way. And they tried it and went nowhere with it. But you see, they tried it on the strength of the words infinite way, not on their consciousness of the infinite way. Now we have those who have the consciousness, and they have developed their own work, their own prosperity, their own patients, their own students, their own book sales, their own tape sales, all out of their own consciousness. Do you see that? Now, individually, we have the right to know that Christ is the activity of being. I will admit that there's quite a handicap in making a statement of that kind, because the natural question comes up, what is Christ? And then you see there's no answer, because it's an impossibility to tell anyone what Christ is. It is as if we were to say anyone can be successful in business if they have integrity. And then you say, but what is integrity? I want to get some of it. Oh yes, but it isn't something you can get. It's a quality of your being that you not only have, but actually that you are. And if you have realized it, you can go in any line of business, learn the physical details of it. The principles of business are all the same. Doesn't make any difference what line you're in. Wouldn't make any difference whether it's a corner grocery store or manufacturing dresses. The principle is all the same. You may have to learn a few different details of operation, but the principle that would make for success in one would make for success in the other, and the principle is integrity. But you can't define integrity, because you say honesty. Oh no, it's something more than honesty. So forth. Well, there it is, that word Christ. Christ is invisible. More than that, Christ can never be known by a human being. Christ can never be explained. Christ can never be understood. It is completely outside the grasp of human awareness. And yet, it is as real as our very presence in this room. Sometimes, when you bring yourself to an actual state of frustration, that is when you are at the very place of Christ realization. If only we can rise to a high enough degree of frustration in trying to understand Christ and having it evade us, and finally get to the point of, I know I can't know it, I don't know it, I can't grasp it, it's beyond me. And if you can just keep that up until you've completely nothingized yourself, then in that moment of the complete frustration, the Christ makes itself known to us. But you'd be as hopeless in trying to explain it to anyone as I am hopeless this minute, because it is beyond the human grasp. I couldn't any more tell it than I could know it, but I can experience it, and I can rely on it. I remember when I first came over to Hawaii, I used to marvel at the people who could lie on top of the water and just leisurely take a stroke that way. Leisurely, and they wouldn't sink. But me, if I didn't keep doing this, I sank. I had to depend on myself, and they depended on something that I know that not one of them was ever able to understand or describe or define. All they know is that they could just reach out, and they stayed on top of the water. Isn't that a miracle? It still is to me, because I still can't get a slow emotion as swimmers can, because they do not depend on this motion of the arm to keep them up. There is something that holds their body up, and they only use the motion of the arm to propel themselves. But not me. I have to propel myself and keep myself on top of the water with it. And that is only because I haven't the swimmer's Christ. And it's really so. They have a faculty. I've seen Emma, she can lie face down on the water and never move hands or feet and stay right on top of the water. I've seen her do it for minutes and minutes and minutes at a time, all the way out to the reef and back. What's her name used to do it too, Hardy. But I haven't achieved that. I have to keep moving. In other words, there is a reliance on myself. But somehow in this work, I never have to rely on myself, physically or mentally. I have that knack, or divine grace, of being able to rest. I can just rest. To me, it's almost like a cloud back here that I rest in. And then everything seems to take place in the outer world. It just takes form and appears before my eyes without any physical or mental effort. That is the Christ. That is the activity of the invisible. And I see other people, oh, they're so busy with the movements of their mind, and sometimes even with physical movements, trying to get somewhere in this work. You can't get anywhere at all except go backwards. It's in the ability to take no thought for your life, what you shall eat or what you shall drink. But the thing that gives you that ability is whatever that Christ is. Now, as an individual attains it, it seems that out of nowhere somebody comes and asks for help. And another somebody and another somebody, and somebody else asks for instruction and so forth, and all of a sudden an activity has built up around that individual. Now, of course, the day will come when this will go on in the world without the name infinite way, without Christian Science. Because one of these days people will be ready to understand that this isn't something that somebody owns or discovers or can transmit. That it is an activity of Christ in individual consciousness, and so they'll just be able to go out to their neighbors who say, what is this you've got? And just say, well, it's a spiritual influence. Well, where do you learn about it, or you don't learn about it? You don't learn about it. Well, what book do you don't read a book. Well, what do? Well, you might as well wake up and begin to believe there's a God. And then they'll be shocked. They thought they did believe it. Oh, no, you've never believed in God. You've never relied on God 1 minute of your life. You may have prayed to God and hoped something would happen, She never really sat back and waited for it to happen. And then as they commenced to understand that actually they haven't believed in God, haven't really believed that there was a God that would maintain and sustain them unto eternity without worry, fear, doubt, then they would begin to develop that Christ within their own being. And they will then make better progress than we who have had to come up through reading books, because we have had this period of mental activity which they will avoid. They won't have to go through the mental steps. Now, just think what it means when you come yourself to the realization there is a spiritual influence in this world. It has nothing to do with anybody's teaching. It has nothing to do with anybody's religion. It has nothing to do with anybody's books. Let's forget books. Let's forget teachers. Let's forget everything in this world except that I am sitting in this chair and that I am not satisfied with my world as it is. And so I start asking myself the question, is there an answer? Is there an answer to this thing of life? And as I ponder and as I question and as my thought thrashes around, pretty soon the idea will begin, well, you know, there must be a God, there must be a principle, there must be something or other. And so it may take days, weeks, months, years, but eventually it will reveal itself that there is a spiritual influence in this world, in this life. Something that existed before there was a world. Something that existed before there was an individual. Then you realize, well, yes, and it is that spiritual influence that is responsible for my being on earth. I didn't bring myself here, and I know enough now to know that parents can't create children. There is a spiritual influence that acts even upon seeds. Where is that spiritual influence? And it naturally follows that it's right where I am. Since it produced me, placed me here, it must be here where I am. Knowing Scripture, of course, that brings us right back to the fact the kingdom of God is within you. Certainly, this spiritual influence, this spiritual presence, this spiritual power is right where I am. Well, my body can't know about it because my body hasn't any knowing faculties. My feet can't know about it, my head can't know about it, the brain can't know about it, but I can know about it. Oh, then it must be within range of my I-ness, my consciousness, my awareness. Then this spiritual power must be within range of my own awareness. I can become aware of it. I can know it. It is within range of my knowledge, my awareness, my consciousness, my being. Therefore, it is where I am. And again, having read a little bit, we remember the poet who said, closer than breathing, nearer than hands and feet. And we say, well, there's two fellows that knew that, Jesus and a poet. And do you see now that we've left out the words infinite way, and we've left out the words Christian Science, and we've left out unity and Catholicism and Judaism, and we find that none of those words or terms are necessary. That actually, whatever there is of a principle is a spiritual influence, and that it's within my own being. It isn't white, it isn't black, it isn't Oriental, it isn't Occidental, it isn't Jewish, it isn't Christian, it isn't Mohammedan. You see? Here you come to that place, not of tolerance. No, you've gone beyond tolerance now. You've almost reached the place of disgust with these great religious leaders who put names on this thing and then claimed they were their discovery, or that it was embodied within their teaching or their organization. Then you commence to understand that this thing called God, spiritual influence of Christ, is as free as the air, as impersonal as the air, and doesn't belong to anybody any more than the air does. Then you really commence to comprehend the idea of religion, true religion. True religion. You'll know why Lao Tse could say, if you could name it, it isn't that. Because now you can't name it beyond saying, well, at least it's invisible, at least it's infinite. Well, now we can invent a new name if we want and call it the infinite invisible, but it'll only take one generation for somebody to do with the term infinite invisible what they've done with God or divine mind or Christ. They'll make it into something that you can explain, and then it'll be lost again. Who can explain that which is invisible? Who can explain that which is infinite? The only reason you're allowed to use the words infinite invisible is because it's a word beyond human, a term beyond human understanding. As long as you can agree that this thing called God is something beyond human understanding, you are approaching holy ground. Now, there is another question. How did all this start? We have come to a point where we agree that there is a spiritual influence, a creative influence. Just through reasoning we can go on and declare that if it created, it must also maintain and sustain, otherwise it wouldn't be infinite. But the thought comes, if that's true, if there is a spiritual influence, and it is within me, or close to me, or within range of my own individual awareness, my own comprehension, certainly I've missed the point somewhere, because I haven't had consciously available to me any spiritual impulse. I have had to work for a living. I have had to use sweat, toil, labor, worry, thought, anxious thought, fearful thought, doubtful thought. And none of that is indicative of this, of which it is said, is not by might nor by power, but by my spirit. And then the question naturally arises, how do I avail myself of it? How do I bring myself into the experience, or how do I bring it into my experience? Let us acknowledge now that there is an it. Let us acknowledge that we do not know its nature, but we do know its effects. The effects appear as harmonious creation, harmonious experience, harmonious body or harmonious being, harmonious activity or harmonious relationships. Let us acknowledge that even though we do not know the nature of the infinite invisible, at least we know its effects, and that having studied the lives of many, we also know that those who actually contacted it found peace. They may not have found the kind of life that metaphysicians are looking for. We may have to change our concept of what harmonious living is. I know that a great deal of the metaphysical world believes that harmonious relationship is indicated by the ownership of a Cadillac car. Might be heavily mortgaged, but riding in it is indicative of spiritual demonstration, or a big home, or something of that kind. And that is not true. That is not true. Spiritual harmony is made evident in a state of absolute contentment, peace, joy. The only discontent is that it provides a drive that does not leave us to just sit around and enjoy the physical good of life. In other words, once one has touched or been touched by that spiritual influence, there is a continuous divine discontent which comes no matter how joyous your experience or how successful, how healthy or how wealthy it is. There is still that divine discontent because you haven't achieved the full realization of Christhood. And it will drive and drive and drive. That is called the divine discontent. Very many of the mystics are disgusted when people come to them and say, I'm looking for happiness. And they say, what will you do with it after you get it? Rot somewhere? Because there is no happiness in the human sense for the person who achieves the Christ, except a momentary happiness. If someone came to them very ill or dying or dead, and they saw them raised up, there'd be a momentary sense of happiness that they had demonstrated the reality of Christ. But the chances are that they'd look out and see 3,999,000,000 more waiting, and that temporary sense of happiness would go, and the divine discontent would come again as to what am I going to do about this other 3 billion? So it is that one's idea of health, wealth, happiness, contentment, peace that passeth understanding changes. Different values become alive. And so you find contentment in very simple surroundings, but you still find the inner discontent because you realize how far your humanhood still is from the attainment or demonstration of its Christhood. Now, this has nothing to do with the neighbor sitting next to you in class or in church. This has nothing to do with the membership. It is so individual that you may go from this moment and attain the most wonderful experience imaginable on earth, while your very next door neighbor or seat person goes on to utter failure, ill health, and so forth. And you say, how could it have been with the same teaching and the same teacher? It had nothing to do with teaching or teacher. It had to do with individual consciousness. Do you see? Now, when you watch this work and you see one person out in the field being very, very, very successful, and you say, well, no wonder they're out there with that Infinite Way, and they've got those Infinite Way books and Infinite Way recordings, and Joel comes around once in a while and gives a class. No wonder they're successful. Don't you believe it? There are more who are failures with all of that than are successes, because it has nothing to do with any of those things. It has to do with what degree of attainment you individually achieve. The same way you may see a businessman go out and with what he understands of this achieve wonderful success in his business world. And you see another just getting nowhere with it, and yet both presumably practicing the same teaching. It isn't the teaching. No, it's whether or not an individual makes contact with that inner spiritual impulse or influence. As a matter of fact, That is all that the infinite way is. It's a revelation, or a restatement of the revelation, that there is a spiritual influence in this world. Some people call it God, and other people call it by other names. But there is a spiritual, a divine influence, and it is available to individuals. It is not available to collective groups, except as collective groups attain it individually. In other words, there have only been a dozen or two students in all of this series, and certainly it has been the highest unfoldment that I have witnessed in my career in the work. And what each one has gotten out of it has had nothing to do with what has been revealed, but what degree of it registered in their own consciousness. And it's the same thing as it goes out into the world in written form or on tape. You would be surprised at the experiences, the differing experiences that take place as students read the monthly letter. Some of whom it brings revelation and realization to, and others who, well, I don't know, if you could read some of the funny letters, you'd wonder what it was doing to them. And so it is with the recordings. From one city, I had the complaint that students feel that it's too much to expect them to listen to an hour of this. Couldn't they just have a half-hour recording? And then we have others who write in, well, I just had a letter this morning, or rather in yesterday's mail, saying that when they complete the evening recording after the meditation, students have asked, can't we have it over again before we go home? Do you see what I'm getting at? That regardless of what the message is, the actual result is what takes place with it or through it in your individual consciousness. And of course, the miracle word is Christ. I don't know the meaning of the word, but that is the word. If there is another word for it, the Chinese had it, and it was Tao. If there is another word, both the Hindus and the Japanese have a word for it, Darshan. But as far as we're concerned, the word is Christ. It's just as meaningless, though, as Tao or Darshan. There's no way to define them. It's a mistake to hook it up with an individual of one particular name, because it is an invisible something that is not the property of any individual, but it is the faculty of any and every individual who can attain it, realize it. Philadelphus, what was the question that started all this? Oh, yes. Well, you see, a lecturer, a teacher, a practitioner in any of the metaphysical schools can present this in any way, under any name, in any form, if so be they themselves attain a measure of Christhood, of realization of this spiritual influence. Then whether they present it as one thing or another makes no difference, because this is to be found in the ancient manuscripts of India, and on this last trip I found it in an ancient manuscript of the Hebrews, that is, of the time of the year 1000 to 1100 A.D. I found this principle just as intact and perfect as it is presented in the infinite way. And they didn't use the word Christ. And yet, it was it. It was it. This Spirit, the same Spirit, the same transcendental, infinite, invisible, that led this particular writer of the 10th century or 11th century to say that we have no right to believe that we can know anything about God except that God is. Of course, he should be paying me royalties for these last 10 centuries, shouldn't he? Do you see that? We have no right. Oh, he goes on to explain that too. And he says that if you were to say God is love, or God is wisdom, or God is strength, or God is beauty, you are saying no more than if you just said God is. Isn't that clear? Isn't that true? Because God constitutes all being, all strength, all beauty, all wisdom, all love. Could there be such things separate and apart from God? No, and so to say God is comprehensive enough. He saw that. I saw that. And then in India I found a manuscript of the 15th century, and he discovered the same thing. See that? These are universal truths. And the tragedy is when some religion says, that's a teaching of our religion and proves that we are correct. Nonsense. That isn't a teaching of any religion. That is merely a teaching. Actually, it's a truth. But it's as universal a truth as the sun up in the sky, or the moon, or the stars, and just as available to any individual who will open their inner eye or inner ear. Christ is yours, Christ is mine. Christ is, and Christ is a state of divine being, an essence, presence, power, that is a joy, a beauty, and it comes into active expression in proportion as our thought ceases, in proportion as we develop an inner sense of receptivity. It is exactly the same idea as if, for instance, we were composers, and we want to bring forth a new melody. Well, I suppose the good composers never want to bring forth a good melody. The good melody just begins to permeate their consciousness and they write it down. But let us suppose that we aren't one of the good ones and we do want to bring forth one. How are we going to do it? We're going to do it by closing our eyes and opening our ear. And just sitting there waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. And if we just wait long enough, and if we go deeply enough into the center of our being, the melody will flow. Why? Music is just as infinite as God, because God is that which constitutes music. And so there could be no end to melodies, no end to new selections. All we have to do is go deep enough where we're not hearing other composers' music, not being influenced by outer sounds, and then we will hear such melodies as the human ear has never heard before, because there are deeper melodies awaiting recognition, deeper ones than Mozart ever heard, or Chopin, or Wagner. There are deeper ones. Why? Because nobody has yet plumbed the depths, the complete depths of God. And the nearer they get to that inner being, the more beautiful melodies will come forth, more beautiful poetry, more beautiful literature, more beautiful paintings, more beautiful sculpture, and so forth and so on. There is nothing that cannot be brought forth from the depths of our own inner being. No one need go outside themselves. Yet the activity will develop in what is called the outer world. The call will come to move here or move there or bring New York to Hawaii or so forth and so on. But the activity will appear in the outer realm, and it will appear as an outer activity, but it will only be brought forth in the same way that you're going to bring forth beautiful music, from the depths of the withinness. And that withinness may also be called Christ, Spirit, spiritual influence, spiritual presence, spiritual power. Anything that is in the mind of God can be brought forth through man, because God is the mind of individual man. And so the individual man has the full capacity of the Godhead. But that is only when his mind is very still. When the mind is very still, very peaceful, very quiet, then God is the mind of every individual, and any and every individual can bring through infinity in proportion to the quietness and stillness of the thinking mind, the reasoning mind. That doesn't mean that we want to get rid of the thinking mind or reasoning mind. We want to keep on using those in the way they were meant to be used, for reasoning and thinking. But we do not bring forth beautiful melodies by reason, but by inspiration. So we bring forth any form of human expression by inspiration. We may then use the thinking, reasoning mind to work out the details of human activity. But first, we must receive the inspiration from the soul. In other words, eventually we will all recognize that the soul, the spiritual influence, emanates from the soul, and that the soul governs both mind and body. Both mind and body are instruments for the soul. Then the mind will function perfectly, and the body will function perfectly. We must come to a place of realization that mind and body are functions of the soul. Soul animates mind and body. Soul uses mind and body as instruments. Just as we use the arm and hand for writing, so does the soul use our mind and body for making itself visible and tangible in human experience, in individual experience. When we know that, we will quiet the mind and the body and let the soul come through, using the spiritual impulse as its means of reaching our individual consciousness. See this, then. There is a soul, and this soul is universal. It is the source of all that is, the source of all purity, purity of music, purity of architecture, purity of mathematics, purity of all experience. And it operates through or as a spiritual influence reaching individual you and me through an inner stillness or silence, through an inner awareness, through an inner state of receptivity. Then as this soul reveals to us its beauties, its harmonies, the mind and the body take over and bring them into visible form and expression. Now that which God does is forever. And so when an inspiration comes from God, it comes through into full fruition. There is no such thing as inventing something and then not having the capital to finance it. No, there is no such thing. Not if an individual realizes that that invention was the activity of the soul, of this universal being coming through individual consciousness, then they will step aside and let the invention come through, and the financing and the advertising and the buying and the selling. So it is with any idea. There is no such thing as an unpublished book or an unpublished piece of music if an individual has received it as a divine inspiration and then realizes that the same source of inspiration is the activity of bringing it to full fruition. In other words, the activity that creates a seed is the same activity that brings it forth as a flower and then as a fruit. The activity that created a seed doesn't leave it a seed and say, well, I can't get it into a tree or into a bud or into the fruit. It brings it through into full expression. Well, I was going to talk about this subject of supply. Supply and health will always be the two major subjects in all spiritual unfoldment until the realization is attained that there is neither health nor supply, that there is only the attainment of the realization of God. The moment there is the realization of God, there is no such thing as health or supply to talk about, or safety or security. Those are words that drop out of your vocabulary, because the only interest that one has is abiding in this realization of God, and all these other things take care of themselves. In other words, God appears as safety, security, the rock, the fortress, the high tower, the cloud by day, the pillar by night, the manna, the water, the wine, the bread, the meat. God appears as these, so one has no concern for these. But until such time as that realization dawns, health and supply, maybe safety and security, will be the subjects most frequently discussed. Now, the unfoldment of the infinite way differs on these subjects from that which will ordinarily be found, because the infinite way makes it very clear that prayer, or even metaphysical treatment, for things like health or supply or safety or security can never succeed. And so instead of concerning ourselves with these, we concern ourselves entirely with the prayer of spiritual realization, the meditation on, well, you might say this, that this hour was a meditation on God or the Christ. But of what value would it have been if the realization of it did not appear as safety, security, peace, joy, health, supply? So it is that if we were to spend an hour in such contemplation as we have this morning, and then found it necessary to give a treatment afterward for supply or health, we would be having supply, health, safety, security as something separate and apart from the realization of the Christ. Do you see that? But they are not something separate and apart from the realization of the Christ. The realization of the Christ constitutes peace, joy, harmony, safety, security, health, and supply. Ah, yes. In the world, when thought turns to supply, one thinks in terms of effects, such as crops, herds, dollars, properties. But in the infinite way, that is not true. None of those things are supply, none of those things constitute supply. And to think of them sets up a sense of separation from supply, because what is supply? The realization of God is the only supply there is. The realization of God is supply. Supply is something within you, not external to you. Supply does not grow on trees. Supply is not printed in a mint. Supply is never held in a safe deposit vault. They may be treasures, but they're not supply. They are the effects of supply. In other words, as long as there is God, there is supply. And as long as there is God, supply will appear as crops and herds and monies and securities and so forth. But try to think in terms of monies, securities, properties, and crops and herds, separate and apart from God, and you have the reason for wars and lawsuits. Wars and lawsuits are always fought over effects, something that's already in existence in the world and two people want them. Whereas the moment there is the realization of supply, nobody wants them. Nobody cares who's got them or who owns them, because the realization of supply produces effects called crops, herds, securities, as they may be needed and beforehand. Try in every way to realize this. When you think of supply, instantly think of God or the Christ as supply. Do not permit yourself to think of any effect as supply, but think of these as the effect of supply. Without having the supply, God, you'll have to struggle hard to get the effects. Having the supply itself, which is God, the effects flow of their own accord. I wanted to conclude with one subject here, and that is the word sin. We are, in this work, going to be called on every day of the week to handle the subject of sin. Whether in ourselves makes no difference. If not in ourselves, certainly in others. And unless we have a spiritual approach to the subject, we will not be of much help to those who want it, or even to ourselves if we come under temptation. The handling of sin is in this wise. First, be sure that no trace of condemnation exists in your consciousness. For the simple reason that a person indulging sin is no more responsible for it than the person who has a headache or a cold. It is only one of the world's discords touching them in a different way. Therefore, to hold them in condemnation would be making it an utter impossibility to bring out healing. It is as if you were to condemn a paralytic because they couldn't walk. And that would be utter nonsense. Now, turn from the sin or the sinner in the realization that a good human is not necessarily more spiritual than a bad human. And then you will almost instantly have had a healing. The moment that you can realize within yourself that you are no more interested in a good human than in a bad human, but in the spiritual entity of an individual, in that moment you have broken the illusory power of sin, false desire, false appetite. Do you see that? Thank you.